Ancient China has quite the reputation for awful punishments, to the point where I'm not even sure how much I can talk about today. There's the familial executions, death by 1,000 cuts, and more. Question for you, what do you think would have been the worst way to go? Let me know in the comments and let's see if it can't get worse. Ancient China had some pretty harsh ways to go. One of them was called yue, which means the amputation of the foot. So imagine living back then and knowing that if you broke certain laws, off goes the foot. This punishment was brutal and served as a strong deterrent against crime. Now there were variations in the punishment in different time periods, where the choice of the foot removed depended on the severity of the crimes committed. So if you're gonna lose the right foot, that's for very serious crimes. Your left foot? Lighter offenses. So this was one of the 5 punishments. It was like a big thing. These were the penalties for the most heinous crimes in China. And this was a thing for close to a millennia before the early imperial period. These punishments were marked by extreme cruelty and designed to cause the most intense physical pain and psychological anguish for the individuals found guilty and the folks around them. The idea of yue was to disable the offender and make them an example for others. Losing a foot wasn't just physically painful. It would mark you for the rest of your life. You'd have to deal with the stigma and the practical difficulties of moving around in a society that didn't have the accommodations we have today. Also, there's no anesthesia, so the pain was intense and immediate. And then you've also got the risk of infection, given the medical knowledge and sanitation practices of the time. Lots of folks aren't going to survive this. At the end of the day, living with one foot in ancient China was incredibly hard. You couldn't walk properly, so you couldn't work effectively, which made it difficult to support yourself or your family. And socially, you're an outcast. People know why you've been punished, and they're not going to go near you. Now, this punishment was common in ancient China for over 1,000 years, until it was abolished in the 2nd century BC, according to a 2019 study in the China Law Review. At one time, up to 500 different offenses could result in having a foot amputated. We're talking rebelling, cheating, stealing, even climbing over certain gates. So I guess there was a lot of people with one foot. The 9 familial exterminations, 9 kinship exterminations, or execution of 9 relations, also known by the names Zuzu or family execution and Mizu or family extermination, was probably one of the most severe punishments for a capital offense in pre-modern China, Korea, and Vietnam. A collective form of kin punishment typically associated with offenses such as treason, this punishment involved the elimination of all relatives of an individual, which were categorized into 9 groups. The occurrence of this punishment was somewhat rare, with relatively few sentences recorded throughout history. So what do I mean by 9 relations? Well, it could include, but was not limited to, the criminal's living parents, living grandparents, any descendants a criminal might have over a certain age, with ones below that age becoming servants, and if married, their spouses, siblings and siblings-in-law, so the siblings of the criminal and that of his or her spouse. Also, we've got uncles and aunts of the criminal, as well as the spouses of your direct relative, your cousins, and I'm talking like second cousins, third cousins, also I mentioned your spouse, right? Well, also your spouse's parents. Pretty much just wipe out the entire family tree for a crime one person committed. So just be on the up and up, or else off goes the family. Alrighty folks, you ever hear people joke about Chinese water torment? Water might not sound as bad as other punishment methods involving spikes, rods, electricity, or sharp or painful objects, because the idea of dripping water on someone, which is what this consists of, sounds almost pleasant. So how can droplets of water be considered torment? Well, I promise you, water can be truly sinister in the right or wrong hand, depending on how you view things. This was a very slow, sometimes painful, and mentally destabilizing form of torment. The incessant and regular water dropping never stopped, and it got worse. It's not clear why officials did this, but sometimes the drops would actually contain acid, which would slowly burn through one's skin and into the brain, making somebody go insane. Its first known description appears in a text written by Italian scholar Hippolytus de Marseilles, who lived in the 15th century. Now, he seemed to have a certain fascination with inflicting cruel punishments on people, because he was known for studying sleep deprivation as a method of torment. In his writings, he meticulously described how a lack of sleep and aggressive interrogation methods can effectively extract information from a victim, or false confession if you know what I mean. It's no wonder this same person would devise a method whose main purpose was to drive a person mad. However, the method he devised originated from a weird conclusion. Supposedly, he observed how drops of water would, over time, erode a rock surface, and he believed that when applied to humans, the same would occur. Yep, that's right. He thought that the water could drill a hole into a person's skull. Now, yes, this punishment is mostly used nowadays as a metaphor for something annoying, but annoying doesn't come close to the horrors this practice supposedly inflicted on its victims. Back to another one of the main 5 punishments we go, Yi, also known as Rhinotomy, where the offender's nose was cut off, and as one can imagine, it would leave somebody scarred for life. But because weapons and important bodily fluids were involved, well, it often resulted in death because of, once again, that infection thing. Living without a nose in China was kinda hard. And we're not just talking like physical difficulty and the constant risk of infection, we've also got that stigma once again. If you don't have a nose, people know right away that you're a criminal. So imagine if you don't have a nose and a foot, it's like, you can't hide your past. Every interaction would be influenced by this visible mark of disgrace. People are gonna avoid you. So you're not finding work, you're not getting any community support. You're exiled. And in ancient China, maintaining social order was crucial. Punishments like this were a way to enforce that order. They were severe, but they were effective in deterring crime. The visible nature of the punishment meant it served as a constant reminder to others of the consequences of breaking the law. So yeah, don't do this unless you want to look like that guy. A Cangue was a device that was used for public humiliation and corporal punishment. And because it restricted a person's movements, it was common for folks wearing these to kind of die because they couldn't feed themselves. Now, the word Cangue is French from the Portuguese canga, which means yoke, the carrying tool which has also been used to the same effect, with the hands tied to each arms of the yoke. Frequently translated as pillory, it was similar to that European punishment, except that the movement of the prisoner's hands was not as rigorously restricted, and that the board of the Cangue was not fixed to a base and had to be carried around by a prisoner. So at times, the Cangue was used as a general means of restraining prisoners, along with leg chains, arm chains. This was particularly true of those with grave sentences or low social standing. And although there were many different forms, a typical situation would consist of a large, heavy, flat board with a hole in the center large enough for somebody's neck. Now this board would be two pieces that would close around said neck and then be fastened shut along the edges by locks or hinges. The opening in the center was technically large enough for the prisoner to breathe and eat, but not large enough for a head to slip back through. And you're going to be confined in there for a period of time as a punishment. And also, this is going to be placed on top of a cage so that your feet can't touch the ground. Now, initially, yes, somebody would put supports under someone's feet so that you could stand without the pressure, but then the supports would be removed, forcing the Cangue to slowly end our lives. Oh, my bad, by the way, I totally went out of order with the big bad 5 punishments. The first was actually known as Mo, where the offender would be tattooed on the face or forehead with permanent ink. Markings were also made on other visible parts of the body, usually words that describe their misdemeanors or the location of their exile or hard labor camp. Now, these tattoos permanently and very visibly marked out their bearers as ex-criminals for life. Not as severe as losing your sense of smell or hobbling, but still not ideal. Look, I know tattoos are all the rage today, but these were ones nobody wanted. Lingchi, usually translated as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of punishment and life-ending used in China from around the 10th century until the early 20th century, and was also used in Vietnam and Korea. This was a long and painful form of death reserved for the most severe crimes. The criminal would be tied to a post, and the authorities would cut little incisions all over their body. The punishment involved flaying pieces of skin, removing muscles, and even body parts to maximize the pain. The sentence would keep the organs functioning and ranged from like 8 to 120 incisions. This punishment worked on 3 levels: as a form of public humiliation, as a slow and lingering death, and as a punishment after death. To be cut to pieces meant the body of the victim would not be whole in spiritual life after death, which was an awful thing. The 4th punishment out of the 5 really bad ones was Gong, the permanent removal of a person's reproductive function. So if you were a guy, your male member was removed and your testicles were cut off, and the offender would be sentenced to work as a eunuch in the imperial palace. Gong for men was applied to the same crime as Gong for women, namely adultery or any kind of promiscuous activity. A very famous casualty was Sima Qian, the emasculated father of traditional Chinese history writing. Now, Gong punishments for female victims probably involved pounding the woman's abdomen with a stick to induce some kind of damage to the womb. The 5th of these bad things was Da Pi, a death sentence. In theory, that probably doesn't sound too bad after everything else I've talked about today, right? Not so much. Here's a sampling of the ways this could be carried out. Methods of death were quartering, or cutting the body into 4 pieces, boiling alive, tearing off an offender's head and 4 limbs by attaching them to chariots, beheading, and then, abandonment of the offender's body in the local public market, asphyxiation, slow slicing. Now, out of all the above, none of those sound good. And finally for today, thumpings were probably the most common form of punishment. For example, offenders could be thumped with bamboo rods or canes, and the number of blows would also depend on the severity of the crime. There are also so many different types of thrashings, so allow me to explain a few. She referred to the thrashing on the rear end with a light bamboo cane. Now, during other dynasties, sometimes bamboo clappers were used instead. Zong was thrashing with a large stick on either the back, rear end, or legs. 2, which combined compulsory penal servitude with 5 degrees of severity in thrashings. Liu, which involved exile to a remote location with no chance of returning to your home, and then also you get your thrashings. Also after these thrashings, death was all too common. And that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.